All right, thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Lots of technical details. So my name's Kyle, Kyle Olney. I'm a senior advisor at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and I'm here today to talk to you guys about the coming era of nation-state hash wars and the implications for the Bitcoin network. So, we don't have the windows open right now, but, you guys are sitting inside the Hoover Dam, which is one of the largest hydroelectric facilities on Earth. And believe it or not, this facility itself is actually the physical embodiment of the problem that I'm here to talk to you about today. So over the course of this talk, I'm going to walk you through a thesis that I think should concern every Bitcoiner, both in this room and around the world. And I believe that the great powers are about to come to the realization that they're sitting on literal oceans of free hash rate. And when they do, Bitcoin's security model is going to face its greatest challenge that it's ever faced. So just as some, kind of like basics about this facility, for those of you who already went on the tour, you'll maybe have a little bit better idea. But this facility produces it's rated at 2 gigawatts of power output, and it produces about 4 terawatt hours per year, which is functionally the equivalent of about 3% of the Bitcoin network's entire hash rate. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, but I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, so don't feel like you need to follow them entirely. Just relative Fermi scale is all you really need. So let's zoom out for a second. From this specific dam, these are all the hydropower dams that are located all around the United States. As many of you will be aware, we're very blessed with our geographic assets in the United States. There's all kinds of stuff here. And basically, we have lots of hydropower among other things that we have lots of. But for now, obviously, we'll just focus on kind of like hydropower, and we'll get into some other stuff later. Given that we have all of this hydropower in the United States, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manages a portfolio of about 75 facilities that have a generation capacity of about 20 gigawatts of energy, which means that it produces somewhere between 80 and 100 terawatt hours per year. And that annual generation is about 50% of the entire Bitcoin network's hash rate, which hopefully is starting to, flash your spidey sense on kind of the scale of assets that the United States government has. And then to talk again a little bit more detail about the market sizing comparison here, 100% of Bitcoin hash rate at the moment is somewhere around 200 terawatt hours a year. Obviously, this fluctuates depending on the difficulty and various other things, but in general, that's about the best number that we've got right now. And the U.S. commercial mining sector is somewhere between 60 and 80 terawatt hours a year, which is about a little more than a third of the global network. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers hydro portfolio alone, just the hydro portfolio, is already 25% larger than the entire United States commercial mining fleet. And it's about half the size of the global hash rate. And in case you think I just cherry picked the Hoover Dam because we're sitting in here and that this is super big, I'll zoom out a little bit more. This is a picture of the Grand Coulee Dam, which is in the Pacific Northwest. It was built during the Great Depression, and it has a 7 gigawatt generation capacity, which translates to about 20 terawatt hours a year, which means that single facility that the United States government operates could power 5 to 10% of the Bitcoin network's needed hash rate on a yearly basis. Okay, but here's the twist, right? A lot of the power that's generated, and in fact, way more than the power that's generated just at this facility, gets thrown away every single year by the United States. And that's because we don't have transmission interconnects, we don't have battery infrastructure, there are all kinds of distribution and delivery problems that exist. And so basically, we end up lighting all of this money on fire, or all of these jewels on fire, right? We just literally do nothing with them. We spill them on the floor, we run them over the spillways here at the dam, in all of these various ways, we basically just literally light these jewels of energy on fire, and we get nothing for the benefit. And so, naturally, you're probably wondering, okay, that's maybe an issue, but it's not just dams, right? We have all kinds of renewable and dense energy assets in the United States. So this is a picture of Edwards Air Force Base down in Southern California. As some of you may be familiar, this is one of the largest air bases in the entire country. It has almost a 1 gigawatt solar array that's connected to it with about 3.5 gigawatts of battery storage that are attached. So it generates 25 times the amount of energy that it needs to maintain itself for the base. And it actually sells the overflow energy back to the surrounding community in Southern California, and that's about $100 million a year for the government for the benefit or the privilege. And this has been such a successful program for the US government that they're actually wanting to stamp these down at every airbase in the entire United States now because of a variety of different strategic reasons that I won't get into in this talk, but effectively you should assume that this is going to continue to happen all over the country. We also have an abundance of nuclear assets, obviously, in the United States. We have the largest nuclear fleet in the world with almost 100 gigawatts of installed capacity. Obviously, for the perspective of Bitcoin mining, nuclear is very powerful because it's got a 90% capacity factor and it's almost always on, which is clearly very helpful for mining. And then the same thing is true with geothermal. We have enormous geothermal assets in the United States, mostly undeveloped at this point. But again, these operate 24/7, 365, really large capacity factors. So they're exceptional for Bitcoin mining. So if you were to add up all of these things, the hydropower, the solar fields, the nuclear fields, and our geothermal assets, the United States is sitting on an enormous portfolio of energy. And every year, as I mentioned, we curtail large amounts of that energy. So somewhere between 20 and 40 terawatt hours ends up getting thrown away on a yearly basis, which is approximately $1 to $2 billion in wasted energy that we're, again, just throwing away on a yearly basis, which if you convert that into Bitcoin at current market prices is somewhere between 15 and 25,000 Bitcoin per year. It's also worth mentioning that this is the curtailment is going up on a year-over-year basis, and so we're continuing to break records, and basically there's no stopping this train. It's going to continue to increase forevermore. And again here, I'll just show you for the scale of US energy assets, the Bitcoin network is quite small. And then inside the larger Bitcoin network, you have the US slice, which is about a third. And then of that 1/3 slice of the Bitcoin network, if you mapped the curtailed energy that the United States currently throws away onto this, you would see that it's a sizable portion of the current network. So the US government alone controls an existing energy portfolio that it dwarfs the scale of the Bitcoin network and a lot of the demand that would be out there for hash. And its marginal cost of production is effectively zero, which here again should maybe start throwing some alarm bells off in your head, because this really, really changes the game theory that we understand about Bitcoin and how the network operates and secures itself. If you happen to have an energy portfolio this large, this cheap, this underutilized, and as an entity you begin to start mining Bitcoin, what do you think that's going to do to the network? Well, on the commercial side, I would argue this is a practical inversion of everything that we currently understand about Bitcoin. The best private miners in the world today get somewhere between 2 and 5 cents per kilowatt hour for their generation. That's an exceptional price, by the way. You're probably paying multiples of that at home, wherever you live in the country. And so, 2 to 5 cents is not nothing, but compared to zero or negative pricing, which is what the US government has, that is a really strong inversion of market dynamics. And effectively what that means is that no private company can compete long-term against the United States government if the US government decides to become a large hashing entity in the outside world, which, basically means that, you're falling into a gravity well, right? When it comes to Bitcoin mining and nation state hashing. The logic is kind of inescapable. Once nation states get into this game and they realize that they can get into it because they have structural advantages relative to every private market participant, the economic incentives and security of the network, I think, are going to get turned upside down because, again, why wouldn't you do this? If you're throwing away billions of dollars in Bitcoin a year just because you didn't plug in some Bitcoin miners at the state level, like how long do you think that problem is going to continue to persist, right? Just rationally. So, this is kind of the point where, you break out the good tinfoil and you might be wondering like, okay, but like, not sure how bad this problem really is, or do I really need to worry about it? Is the government actually moving toward making such moves? Well, I would argue that yes, we're already seeing undeniable policy signals from the US government. We had the strategic Bitcoin Reserve executive order from last year, which also contained agency directives to every federal government agency to identify budget neutral acquisition methods for adding Bitcoin to the strategic reserve. And again, the US government, just by creating the reserve and then holding, what is currently about $25 billion worth of Bitcoin, I would argue is a very interested party in this area and will continue to do it. And of course, what is the most budget neutral way that you could acquire Bitcoin? Well, you would just mine with the energy that you're already wasting. And you don't even have to wait to see whether or not this is a reality that's coming to us from the government side, because there's proofs of concept already out in the wild. So many people here will be familiar with the idea that down in El Salvador, they are trying to use their volcano geothermal energy to do domestic mining, and they're stacking as much as they can down there, issuing volcano bonds to build out more of those assets. People will be less familiar, but another very strong example of this is the Kingdom of Bhutan. They have really substantial hydropower assets that they've been utilizing for years now, and it's allowed them to build a really sizable stack of Bitcoin, and they are actually the largest per capita Bitcoin holding country in the world, and it's materially inflected their personal financial resources inside the country and made a huge difference for the quality of life for their people. So again, and I would say that the hash rate genie is kind of already out of the bottle when it comes to nation states and how this market is going to develop, which leads us to my belief that we are entering the great hash power competition, or the era of great hash power competition. And, again, you might think, okay, well, inevitable, this is going to happen. But, the thing that's really challenging about this from a Bitcoin perspective, and then also from a US Bitcoin perspective, is we are not the only global power who is sitting on literal oceans of stranded energy. China is currently, without doubt, the world's dominant energy superpower. And this is something that clearly the US government is aware of, but I would argue is not making nearly enough progress on. China is really a hydropower monster. So they've got about 440 gigawatts of hydro capacity, which is 4 times the entire US total. They've got a 20 times larger portfolio than the US Army Corps of Engineers portfolio, and they curtail somewhere north of 60 terawatt hours a year, which is literally the entire US commercial mining fleet. So they literally just throw away more energy on a yearly basis in China, just in their hydro power portfolio, than the entire United States mining industry points at hashing for Bitcoin. And of course, China is also a solar juggernaut. They're almost a global monopolist in this area at this point, and they're continuing to scale materially. So here you can see the graph. This is the difference between the Chinese power industry and the United States power industry. Last year, China added 500 gigawatts of new capacity in 1 year. So that 500 gigawatts they added just last year is larger than the entire US grid installed in the year 2000, even in the year 2005, almost up until 2010. They're probably going to create more, or they're going to add more generation capacity just this year in China than we had in entirety in the United States in the year 2010, which is incredible. It's insane. And they're adding at a rate that's 10 times the rate that we're adding here in the United States. So this year will be a record-breaking year in the United States. We'll add somewhere between 50 and 80 gigawatts. The Chinese are expected to add somewhere north of 750 gigawatts this year. So again, this should kind of scare you. And again, for comparison, you see here, this is just their curtailed energy in China. So they went from 65 in 2024 to almost 100 in 2025, which means that 2 years ago, the Chinese curtailment was larger than US Bitcoin in mining. And by next year, China's curtailment will probably be the size of the entire Bitcoin network, or in the neighborhood of the entire Bitcoin network. And then clearly there's another important twist here, which is that at least as it relates to China, there's incredible hardware vulnerabilities, right? China is responsible, and Bitmain is responsible for producing 97% of the top-end Bitcoin mining hardware that it's out there today. Clearly that's an enormous supply chain problem. This is very similar to a lot of other supply chain problems that we have in the United States vis-a-vis China. But specifically as it relates to the Bitcoin network, this is a real existential risk when you add it up with the energy access that we were just talking about. So being able to have both the energy and the hardware infrastructure cornered makes things very scary from both a US Bitcoin perspective, and then I would argue for everybody in the Bitcoin network's perspective. And of course, China's not the only competitor with these assets, right? There are plenty of other people. I don't really have the time to go deeply into this, but needless to say, Russia, Brazil, India, Canada, whether they're aligned, unaligned, frenemies, you name it, there's all kinds of sovereign powers out there who have access to very similar resources. And this one cutout that I will show is just an example of Brazil. Brazil's not like really thought of as a major strategic competitor of the United States, but just look at the scale of how fast their curtailment is moving up the curve now in the last couple years. And you can get a sense that like, this is a problem that exists and it's starting to pop up in many places around the world and kind of affects the network. And so why is this really concerning? In my opinion, it's because the game theory that we have understood or relied upon in private commercial sort of contexts is just radically different when it comes to state actors because they have totally different motivations. I won't belabor this slide because you guys are all super familiar with it here, but I mean, effectively, the classical deterrence model on a 51% attack assumes an economically rational actor, right? Well, states are rational actors, but their sort of value function is not economic, right? It's power and control. And so the reality is that if it is in China or some other power's interest to crash the Bitcoin network because it represents an existential challenge to them, it represents free speech, whatever it is that they're against, it doesn't matter whether they have to light $10 billion of mining hardware on fire to do so, they will do so because they print their own local currency units and it all comes out in the wash anyway. It's just about their strategic power objectives. And again, here I'll skip over some of this, but let's just suffice to say there are a lot of reasons why governments would want to mine that are more than profit. It could be censorship and rearranging the blocks or censoring certain transactions. It could be silent accumulation in the network. You don't want to like announce that you're building a $100 billion or $200 billion position in Bitcoin until you do. You might want to use it as leverage over the network. So I think like China, for instance, could very easily just threaten to destroy the network, and that has consequences in the same way that nuclear deterrence does. And then you could just want to destabilize the network. You could just be a chaos agent. Like you might not really have any other objective other than just, hey, I don't like what's going on here and I want to blow it up. And so I would argue that the most dangerous scenario that we confront right now is that we could have one or many nation state hashing actors who are building up sizable percentages of hash rate quietly in the background, and we would be none the wiser. And it's actually the most dangerous scenario is the one where you have somebody who pushes, actually this is kind of like the current Iran situation. They don't have a nuclear weapon yet, but they're so close to being able to reach and grab a nuclear weapon that it's threatening and dangerous, regardless of your feelings about what's going on in the Middle East right now. The same thing is true here, right? Like China or another adversarial actor doesn't need to get a 51% control over the hash rate. They just need to be within striking distance and then have the like feasible ability to extend and then take their attack. And then here's like really the thing that I want to pose to everybody in this room, right? As a thought piece and something that we all need to consider as Bitcoiners, like what are we going to do if and when this happens, right? Like in my opinion, it's kind of an inevitability given kind of what we're looking at, but we don't have a lot of prior art for 51% attacks other than, kind of very early ones, like there's Ghash and some other stuff that happened very early on in the network. We haven't seen anything serious in a long, long time. The solutions that existed back in the old days, or whenever we've seen a private commercial 51% attack threat, basically are off the table. Like social signaling, pool migrations, these are great. China's not going to do that because you asked them nicely. That leaves us with things that are basically non-trivial or kind of existential from a Bitcoin network perspective. We can either do things like hard-coded checkpoints to prevent block reorgs, or we can increase the cost to execute double spend attacks by extending confirmation times. These are probably like decent first, sort of responses, but they're not actually going to solve the problem of a motivated attacker like China actually deciding that this is important to them. And so that really kind of leaves us with some place that we never dare to go. And frankly, I think we need to start having some conversations around, which is what kind of consensus changes would be required in order to prevent nation state capture of the Bitcoin network. There are some ideas that I've thought through and I've talked to others about, but suffice it to say that they're all sacred cows that would, like the quantum debate, need to entail substantial internal community dialogue and sort of wrestling to come to a conclusion about what we feel is the best answer to what is an otherwise existential question, right? You can either have immutability, the way that we like to believe that Bitcoin should exist and can exist, or you might have to have the choice of survival, right? You just have to adapt. You have to change the consensus protocol. You have to do something, or you're going to get captured by a foreign hostile state, or potentially, our own hostile state, right? If the United States had a different interest for the Bitcoin network than, we, the average users of the Bitcoin network, would have. And so the question is, at what point does defending the network from capture dictate consensus changes? I think that in general, there are some ideas here around like hash rate transparency, having formalized response frameworks, figuring out ways that we can diversify the ASIC supply chain, figuring out if there's layer 2 solutions that we could like route around these hostile actors. There are a number of different potential things that we could do. But again, none of them are like easy reaches or like easy asks of the Bitcoin network, either from a technical or frankly, more importantly, a social layer today. And so like the quantum debate, I think that, we really need to have a robust dialogue inside the community about like, what would we do? Like, what are our actual response mechanisms in the event that this happens, which again, in my opinion, would seem the logical endpoint of where things are headed on a long enough time horizon. And then how do we go about making those improvements? So, again, to me, I think the logic here is pretty inescapable. The energy is it already exists. The jewels are there. The government has access to them. They're effectively free. The incentives are real. As I said, we're talking about billions of dollars a year in present value that we're both throwing away and allowing, or the US government is allowing, or governments around the world are allowing Bitcoin to just go out the door. And people are starting to figure this out at the nation state level. So the real question, in my opinion, is whether the network will be ready for what comes next when this reality is broadly understood and we're actually confronted with the existential challenge of nation state hash wars. And so, in my opinion, I think we've already crossed the Rubicon. It may only be the first inning, but this is a game that I think we're currently engaged in, and in one that is going to become ever more important as each subsequent year goes by. And so, I would really want to ask everybody in this room to seriously consider this potential outcome and what we can do to prevent or maintain, let's say, the network as we, kind of love it and enjoy it and understand it today. So with that, I'll take any questions you guys have got.
Interesting talk. What are we afraid a nation state would do if they had 40, 50% of the hash rate? I mean, They're going to censor somebody, but there's still the other 60%. Like, why does it matter? I mean, we need consensus cleanup so they can't just break the network. Everyone do consensus cleanup work. But other than that, what are we afraid of? Who cares?
When you say we, you mean?
Like, who cares if a nation state has 51% of the hash? I don't care.
You don't care if they can reorder blocks or censor transactions or any of those things? What do you mean? Who's got the rest of them? Right, but if you can never regain control so that you are the dominant longest chain, how is that? Thank you, Shinobi. I'm going to take that as moving to the next question, but I'm happy to talk afterward. We should debate.
So there's a hardware element that's getting ignored too, right? Like,
yeah.
It just completely dismisses how much physical things would have to exist to harness that amount of electricity. Not to mention, it wouldn't be in a vacuum, and all the other nation states are the ones that matter would also increase, and you get that arms race, and so there's no gaining of control of the network.
Yeah, but if China controls the entire supply chain for mining hardware.
Of course, but even if they did control 100% of it, what is the cost to harness that amount of electricity with chips that don't exist? I mean, it's a massive amount of material and time to create all of that, correct?
Well, yes and no. Mm-hmm. I mean, as we saw in the presentation, right, like they've got things like the Three Gorges Dam and massive industrial infrastructure project. I mean, they literally stamped down cities that are larger than anything in the United States in the course of days to weeks in China. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't underestimate the ability for China in particular to move into this market, which at the moment I would say is the primary risk I see. Like, I don't really see anybody as a material risk in this regard right now, today, other than China. But you have to kind of like complete the checklist of items, right? And the largest item that most people were unable to do or check off on the list was getting access to the energy, right? Energy is the primary input cost in Bitcoin mining, and so if you can't get cheap or zero cost energy, like it doesn't really matter, right? But once you have that, which China has in spades, then you move to the next layer, which is, do you have the mining hardware? And again, like in China's case, yes, they have literally all of the mining hardware. If they decided to cut the whole rest of the world off, they would be able to monopolize the entire ASIC supply chain for years, and nobody would be able to catch up for a long time. So yeah, maybe hypothetically there's a universe where like China makes a move like that, the network decides to brick all of their ASICs, we make a proof of work change, move to some new hardware scheme, everybody has to start over from scratch. But even if you were going to do that, when you restart, presumably, again, you're still going to have to be bounded in a proof of work context to energy as the primary input. Nothing changes from the competitive positioning that you were in before. Now you're just in an even harder ground race when it comes to like hardware requirements. And do you have access and ability to produce that hardware at the speed that, again, like today, the Chinese can? I would argue nobody in the world can compete with the Chinese today on hardware manufacturing. So again, like I don't see this as a game where we have like 20 or 30 competitors right now. It's primarily the Chinese, but I think that that's an existential enough risk that even now we should be very concerned about it.
So a couple of thoughts would be, one, when you're doing the breakdowns of the sources of energy in the world, it'd be an interesting piece to look into to the earlier point on CapEx, what is the potential, like I know you wouldn't be able to have those exact numbers, but how much rough circuits of ASICs exist even, and where are those geographically located? I think a very happy stalemate would be a third of it living in China, a third of it living in Russia, and a third of it living in the United States, because they're very unlikely to all agree with each other. Right. Yeah. And I would more mirror the United States position of strategic ambiguity than a one China policy saying that China has the manufacturing today because it's in Taiwan, most of it with TSMC. Yeah. So like, I think that's an important asterisk where that could easily flip at a switch notice. Like there could be a global conflict and that could just become Chinese control. But as of this moment, with Taiwan not being 100% under Chinese control for the distribution manufacturing things through TSMC, is just another element to keep in there. But that'd be interesting to like think about. You have a massive, like with Moore's law cascading off, where all the S9s sure, they contribute some amount of hash rate, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the X21s or whatever that's out now. Understanding what that current supply of chips are out there, and then like how long would it take to do that?
Replicate.
Not to mention, with the push of all this AI compute now, it's harder to get space on the fab floor to even make new ASICs. Right? There's actually a possible universe where the hash rate's going to kind of plateau because Google, Meta, and NVIDIA, they're just going to own the entire chain of building these things, and no one's going to care about ASIC, and also for energy consumption too, I guess.
Yeah.
But those would just be interesting things to think about in general.
No, I love that you brought those up. That's actually two. I don't know. I know we're like over time. I don't know if they're going to cut me, but yeah, like the two things that you mentioned there are actually two of the best like good news stories about the risk. If this were 3 years ago, pre-AI, I would have been like 10 times as concerned. But now there's actually something else to soak up all of that energy that actually requires you to make a trade-off decision. So the very existence of AI and its competition with Bitcoin hash rate is actually good for us as Bitcoiners because it kind of prolongs and delays this argument that we were just having. And then man, there was a second thing you touched on there that I forgot, but I would want to go to the next question. And yeah, no, it was great. No, but it was awesome. It really is.
So we're technically on a 20-minute break, but I'll let the Q&A keep on going. We have fresh coffee and all of the Costco snacks you'd ever want in the other room, and more Q&A.
So you mentioned like most of your numbers are based off of like curtailment, where it's just like wasted energy.
Yeah.
But like from my understanding, it's like that's not just like a constant stream you can just like tap into. It's like most of the time the wind farm is underproducing, and then massively winter day, and we just burn it all. So you can't really use that to mine because it's like you'd have to have like that many ASICs there, and you could use it for that like one day. But most of the time, those ASICs wouldn't have any power to do because you're just selling it to the city and stuff.
That's true in the case of like wind in particular, or also to some degree solar, where you might not have like good weather or something like that. But that's definitely not true of things like hydro, geothermal, nuclear, which are all like why I kind of centered the numbers around those.
I see.
But your point is still well taken, which is that there are sort of challenges to connecting these things in. There's another version of this that's also about sort of strategic defense, right? So like the examples of like the Edwards Air Force Base, sort of example, like there are thoughts around, for instance, let's say that China were to achieve a dominant hash position on hydro resources that they had that were much larger than anybody else could compete with. Well, what's to stop an F-18 from flying over and dropping a bomb on the dam? Like now it's a very hard thing to just reconstruct and plug back in. But without getting too far down the rabbit hole on this thing, like you can imagine that sufficiently motivated governments of a certain caliber, the United States, China, kind of like a handful of the ones at the top, they are capable of doing this, and they're capable of utilizing 24/7, 365 baseload demands.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, in light of what just recently happened, a couple of days ago with the admiral that talked about the military, do you see that in this framework, that's what they're starting to realize it is a strategic concern?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I actually think that probably was among the most, proof positive and like happenstantial things that happened 2 days ago, right before I was coming to give this talk. It's not a surprise that the Navy, who operates the largest deployed nuclear fleet in the entire world, the U.S. Navy, operates the largest deployed nuclear fleet in the entire world of anybody, right? Even like the French government, for instance, which is one of the largest nuclear generators in the world, like they're not as big as the U.S. Navy. It's not a surprise that they're paying attention to Bitcoin. And it's not a surprise that they are, again, aware of things like hydropower and things of this nature. So I would say that, again, this is something that the governments aren't talking about too publicly, but they are, in my opinion, if you read the tea leaves, you can see pretty clearly that they're doing a lot of work on it on the background, and they can kind of see what's coming. And so naturally, you would expect that like China and other kind of global adversaries are also paying attention.
So not all nation states benefit the same from debasement and stealing wealth from their citizens. Do you think that there's a possible future where the big three, maybe top 5 nations, have an incentive to attack Bitcoin, meanwhile the El Salvadors and the Bhutans and other small nation states actually defend it?
Yeah, so actually you gave me the connect back to Rob's point that I'm going to come back to. So the other thing that is actually encouraging to me about this situation, having gamed it out with some friends who are core devs and kind of thinking about things, is that we kind of benefit from the 18th century balance of power dynamic, right? Where nobody wants one individual to get so large, and so you would naturally see like these clusterings or groupings of people who have liquid sort of friendships with one another, where you could see like, okay, if China were the one that was going to try to push to a 51% attack on the network and had the means to do that as a plurality winner, they probably can't compete with the entire rest of the world saying, we're not going to allow you to take over the chain and we're going to do what we need to exclude you from the network, right? And so in the same way that we saw like European monarchies in the 18th century, like nobody could get too powerful because if they got too tall, like everybody else would come in and make war on them. I actually kind of believe that that might be the actual answer, even if governments end up pushing all the commercial people out of the sector and it becomes an exclusively government thing to mine Bitcoin. You could still see a universe where the balance of interests is such that everybody collectively can exert pressure on one or two small players regardless of size in order to get them to abandon a hostile attack on the network. So I would hope that game theory, which we saw play out in prior eras in kind of a more analog military context, would apply here. But I think the short story is we just don't know, right? And I think like for a project as important as Bitcoin, we should have like more solid answers than we don't know what happens when China or X nation state has the ability to hostile capture the network, right? We need to have better answers than we currently have. So, did that sufficiently answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, everybody.